Hey friends, I just want to give you a little spoiler about the video that you're going to see. This is a video I recorded about a year ago. I had intentions of dropping it and releasing it, but I just never quite got around to it. So it's kind of been sitting in the vault, if you will. In the past few weeks, we have learned that our wonderful Donna Jordan from Jordan Fabrics is no longer with us. And so I thought maybe as a tribute to Jordan Fabrics, I could release this video. In the video, I take a free pattern from Jordan Fabrics. I use the technique that Donna Jordan showed us, which I will link in the description box down below, and I modify it so that I can make it with the pre-cuts and the fabric that I actually have on hand instead of the fabrics that the pattern called for. As a reminder, I would love it as a result of this video if you went over to Jordan Fabrics and you supported them. Make a purchase, download a pattern, watch some of their tutorial videos. There are a number of ways that you can help support the Jordan family, and some of them don't cost you anything but your time. Thank you guys so much for sticking with that intro, and let's get to the video. Have you ever found a quilt pattern that you just had to make, but you didn't want to make it as big as the original pattern called for? Or maybe you didn't have the fabric or pre-cuts that the pattern called for to make the quilt in the original configuration? Well, that's exactly what we're going to talk about in today's video. Hey friends, welcome back to my sewing room. My name is Becca, and today I've got a little bit of a different video for you. I found a free pattern and tutorial over on Jordan Fabrics, and I will link both to the free pattern and the tutorial video in the description box down below this one. I want to walk you through step by step how I made that quilt, even though I didn't have the layer cake that they said you should use for the pattern. I want to show you how I took that quilt layout, did some quilt math, and customized it so that I could use a charm pack instead. Okay, so this video is going to be just a little bit different because I have no idea if what I'm trying to do is going to work. These squares used to be a charm pack. They were 5 inches squared, but I starched all of them to see if they would shrink. Spoiler alert, they do. And if you want to see a video that I did an in-depth demonstration of that on, I will link it in the description box down below. Since all of these squares were starched and they were no longer 5 inches squared, I did have to size them up. So I am squaring them all down to 4.5 inches. I actually already did that. And then I pulled an accent fabric, a 1/2 yard, and 1 yard of background fabric. I feel like this is not what I really will need for the project. I am worried that I may have over pulled the 1/2 yard for the accent fabric, and I think the background fabric might be too much, but you know how background fabric tends to be underestimated, and maybe I'll actually need 2 or 3 yards. But here's the good news. In the description box down below, I'm going to put a link to the pattern from Jordan Fabrics that inspired this project. And I'm also going to list out the final fabric requirements that I actually needed for this quilt, along with all of the cutting instructions. So if you want to make the quilt that I'm making that was inspired very heavily by the Jordan Fabrics quilt, then you've got everything you need. All right, I need to get this starched and cut up. Okay, the quilt layout that Jordan Fabrics has is basically these squares that are on point. And the way they're putting them together is diagonal rows, and then they're sewing those rows together, and they're putting some setting triangles in the empty spaces to kind of square it up. And so what I need to figure out is how am I going to build those accent squares. You see, in the quilt, they're alternating the print squares with squares that have that stripe, so that your layout, is that right? Nope, we gotta do one more here. So that that layout kind of starts to create a secondary pattern. In some of the rows, the stripes are going vertical, and in other rows, they're going horizontal, and they kind of just repeat that pattern throughout the entire thing. My first problem is I got to figure out how I'm going to make this unit and ensure that when this whole block is sewn together, it measures at 4.5 inches by 4.5 inches because that is also the size of the print that I'm working with. So in order to figure out how I'm going to get to this unit, I need to think about that block. That block looks like this. And it doesn't matter whether it's rotated so that the stripe is going sideways or up and down. It's the same block. I know that this is 4.5 inches this way and 4.5 inches this way. And I have total control over what this looks like. So I just got to think about this stripe in the middle. How thick do I want this to be? Well, I'm going to make this 1 inch finished. That means after I sew it into the block, it should be 1 inch, which also means to cut it, I need to add my seam allowance. So my math, whenever I'm trying to figure out what I need to cut, is to always add a 1/2 inch to the finished size. So I have the finished size of 1 inch up and down plus my 1/2 inch, which gives me 1.5. So now I know up and down this way I need 1.5 inches. But this is a squared up size because there's nothing else being sewn onto that strip from left and right. So I'm just going to carry that 4.5 down here. So I know for all of my stripes that are going to go in the middle, I need pieces that measure 1.5 by 4.5. Now let's talk about these two pieces. This is where it gets a little complicated and could probably hurt your brain. If I know that the side here is going to measure 4.5 inches, and this is going to be 1 inch of that space, I no longer care about the seam allowances because they're sewn out, then what I have to do is take my 4.5, subtract my 1, and that gives me 3.5. If I want this to be directly in the middle, then I just need to divide this in 2 so that I have the same distance on top and bottom. Now there's one more thing that I have to do. I don't care about the seam allowance up here because I'm not working with the finished size. I'm working with the squared up size, but 1/4 inch of the top and 1/4 inch of the bottom piece is going to have to be worked into my cutting equations because it's sewn right here and right here. So I'm just going to add 1/4 inch to that 1.75, which takes me to 2. So if you're tracking here, this unit is going to be comprised of a 1.5 inch cut by 4.5 inch cut piece, and this would be a 2 inch by 4.5 inch, and this would be a 2 inch by 4.5 inch. And then when we sew this together, what we should see is that this unit will measure 1 inch by 4.5 inches, and then the top and the bottom will each measure 1 3/4 by 4.5. I hope all of that made sense, but don't worry if this hurts your brain, because I know math is a thing for some people. I've typed all this up in the description box down below, so you can just take my quilt math and do this exactly the same way I am. From the accent fabric, I'm going to cut a strip that is 4.5 inches by width of fabric. And then I'm going to subcut a bunch of 1.5 inch pieces out of this. And so I'm doing that by finding a number that can be divided by or is a multiple of 1.5 inches. For this ruler, I know 10.5 is a good place to start. And so I cut my little strip set or my little piece of fabric down to 10.5 inches. And then I move the ruler over so that it's at 9 inches, and I cut off a piece because that's going to give me my 1.5. Then I move it to 7.5, cut a piece off, 6, cut a piece off, 4.5, cut a piece off, 3, cut a piece off, and then finally 1.5. And by doing that, what I'm essentially doing is making my cutting a little bit more efficient. And I'm making sure that it's pretty accurate because I'm measuring all of these from that one line, that one cut, not a copy of that cut over and over again. Now I do have one piece in here that has some selvage on it, so I'm probably not going to use that, but the one on the other side should be okay. I'm just going to double check. Yep, everything's okay. So this piece is probably just going to be waste. Now let's cut our background. We said we wanted 2 inches by 4.5 inches. So I'm going to do the same thing that I did here, except I'm going to do 2-inch chunks. I'm going to cut a strip of 4.5-inch piece of fabric for my background. And then I'm just going to go through and cut 2-inch chunks out of this. So find a number that is a multiple of 2. You just need an even number. 10 works for me. So I'm going to cut off this end. That's going to go through both layers. I'll flip it around and put that cut edge right on the 10-inch mark of my ruler. Then I'll cut through over here. And now I'm just going to start moving my ruler down 2 inches cut, 2 inches cut, 2 inches cut. You get the idea. I'm only going to subcut this one strip though. And if I was smart, I would actually stop here, sew this, and see if it works. But I feel like I'm pretty confident in my math. So I'm going to go ahead and cut up this one strip and we'll see what happens. So to sew one of those squares together, we're going to need 2 of our background pieces and 1 of our accent pieces. And we're just going to lay it out like that. We're going to take a 1/4-inch seam here and here, and I am going to press the seams underneath the dark fabric to help prevent any shadowing business that might be going on. Once I have this center stripe sewn in here, I'm going to press the seams underneath that accent color and then give it a little bit of heat with a hot dry iron. And then the moment of truth comes in with making sure that it hits where it needs to hit. This square should be 4.5 inches, and what I am really mostly concerned about is this direction or this size, but I'm looking at it and it looks a little wonky over here too. So let's take a look and see what we've got. Actually, that is spot on. All right, so let me show you at what I'm looking at. This is good. Sometimes things look like they're not going to work out until you bring the ruler in. So let that be a lesson to you. First thing that I'm looking at is this squaring, is this 4.5 inches right now? It is. There is actually a teeny bit up here. I could stand to square this up if I wanted to. But the other thing that I'm looking at is the center piece of fabric. I'm checking to see if that is 1 inch wide. I can see that over here it is spot on, but down here it's maybe a thread off. I'm not going to worry about that. I think it's going to be fine in the finished project, but it is something to keep in mind if you want absolute perfect accuracy. And then I'm going to make sure that this size and this size are equal distance. Remember I said this should be 1 3/4 up from the top and bottom. So that's how you can check to make sure that this is perfectly in the center. You want to make sure that this strip is 1 inch in width and the distance from the top and the bottom is exactly the same. And if you're following the sizes that I'm using, that would be 1 3/4. I'm going to go ahead and just clean it up a little bit. Nothing there. A little bit there. Nothing there. A little bit there. So now I'm going to make a bunch of these because this is how our quilt is going to start going together. We're going to set this on point and then work these in. So got lots of sewing to do, but it's good to know that my math actually worked. So to figure out how many of those accent blocks I need, I'm going to use Pre-Quilt. This might not be a tool that you're familiar with. I know a lot of people talk about EQ8, but I kind of feel like for some things, Pre-Quilt is easier to use, and it is a web-based design software, so I can do it on my iPad, I can do it on my computer. It's wherever I go. It doesn't have to be installed application that is completely on my actual computer. But you do have to pay a annual membership for it, so it's not a buy it once and you have it forever type of thing. So I'm just going to create a new quilt, and when that pops up, it's going to ask me what type of blank quilt I want to start with. I've got a few options in here. I know I want the one that's set on point, so I'm just going to hit use this grid. It was just a 5x5. I can change that later if I need to. Once this loads, I'm just going to work with two different color squares that are set on point to resemble my print and my stripe squares. So where I have this area that says one patch blocks, I'm going to tap on the plus, and for the print, I'm just going to make that black. So I'm going to hit this add to quilt, and right next to this black, it gives me a number with an X after it. That tells me how many times that color or block or patch or whatever is represented in the quilt. So I'm going to start filling this in, following that pattern of alternating my prints, but also paying attention to the counter, because when that gets at or near 21, I'm going to need, oh, look at that. I'm going to need to start reversing this because I have 42 that I'm going to use for my charm pack. So this is exactly 21. That's halfway. Now I need to start making this smaller again so that my quilt is square or rectangular. So I'm just going to keep filling this in. And that's 36. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So this is 6 by 6 right now. If I want to use all 42 pieces of my charm pack, I can just add either another column or another row. I'd rather have my quilt longer than wider, so I just added another row down to the bottom. Now I've got 42 of those, so I know I'm going to use all 42 of my prints. I'm going to take this green and I'm going to fill it in to the areas where I know I need that accent striped square, and this is just to help me count how many of those I'll need. I need 30. So that helps me know how many of those little striped squares I'm going to sew. But while I'm here, I might as well add this third color in. And this will tell me how many setting triangles I'm going to need. I'm not going to worry about the corners. That'll be separate. That'll be something a little different. So I need 22 of those setting triangles, and then I'm going to need 4 for the corners, but we'll figure that out later. Okay, I'm going to go make 30 of these, and then I'll show you how I'm going to cut my setting triangles. This is probably the fastest quilt that I have ever made. These sewed up really quickly, and this was all starched and cut down before the project was ever even figured out. The next step that I need to do, though, is cut out my setting triangles. I need 22 of these, and these are the little triangles that are going to go in around the perimeter of the quilt, not including the corners. That's going to be something different. To do that, I want to basically cut a square on the diagonal so that every square gives me 2 triangles. So I need 11 squares because I need a total of 22 triangles. Half of 22 is 11. So how am I going to figure out what size I'm going to cut those squares at? Well, I know all of my little blocks are 4.5 inches, and I want to give myself some extra room. So I'm just going to round up to 5. That means the setting triangles are going to be bigger than what I need. There is going to be a little bit of waste here, and I will have to square things up when it's all done, but I'm okay with that. I would rather have these triangles be a bit bigger than to have them cut absolutely precisely and find center every step of the way. I want some margin for error. So I have cut 2 strips of fabric, 5 inches by width of fabric, and from each of these I am going to subcut as many 5-inch squares as I can get. I only need 11. I think I can get 8 out of each one, but we'll see. Once all of my squares are cut, these 4 are extra, so I'm just going to set them aside. This is 12 because each pile of this is 4. I need 11, so I'm actually just going to take 1, put it over there. Now I've got my 11 squares, and I'm going to cut each of these piles directly on the diagonal from one corner to the other. Because these are bigger than I need them to be, they don't have to be absolutely precise. There is a little bit of margin for error, so you don't have to worry about finding that exact 45-degree line. Just eyeball the corner to corner and cut. So my quilt is all laid out on the floor, and the layout is going to be really kind of cool. I kind of like how I have that secondary pattern that looks like it's framing those charm squares. This is a quilt that is set on point, and the easiest way to do it is to take the diagonal rows and sew them together. So back over here by my sewing machine, I have grabbed my first row, and these were the fabrics in the upper right corner of the quilt. This is for the top row, and this is for the side row, and then I have my charm square here. This doesn't look right. It doesn't feel right if you're used to piecing things by rows, but this is essentially what you're building out. Just ignore that this isn't a square and this isn't a square. When you put this together, you're going to want to make sure that you're lining up that short edge of both of the triangles with the sides of the square. Don't worry that the triangle hangs off either end. The most important thing is that this raw edge is lined up and this raw edge is lined up. When that's done, we're going to press so that the seam is underneath the print, and then we're going to do the other one over here, and then our first row will be done. And we're just going to keep repeating that, going all the way through all of the rows, and then we're going to sew the rows together just like we would a traditional quilt, except our rows start with a triangle and end with a triangle. Once those pieces are sewn together, you should kind of have something that's starting to look a little bit like a circle or I don't know. It looks like a triangle with the top pointed off or cut off. It should look like this. We're going to have those seams pressed underneath our print, so I'm just going to give this a dry press to get those seams to lay nice and flat. And what that's going to allow is, if we continue as we're building out our rows, to always press underneath the print, not the straight pieces or the triangles, then our seams, as we're assembling those rows together, are going to go in opposite directions, and it's going to make it a whole lot easier for us to nest our seams, getting really nice points when we put this quilt together. All right, the first row's done. Let's grab the second row and sew that together. I will say that when you're picking up your fabrics and bringing your row over to the machine, you'll want to make sure that you're paying very close attention to the layout of how your row was put together. So it's probably a good idea to pick it up all the same way, so that when you come over and sit down and start getting it sewn together, you can kind of lay it out and make sure that your fabrics are still oriented the way that they're supposed to be. Every time we sew a row together, we should be kind of creating this curve at the start and finish. And if you're sewing from the left and right, then they'll be doing this way. For half of the quilt, the angles will be going this way, and half of it, it'll be going this way. But good thing is, what I'm doing right now is all the same stuff that Jordan Fabrics has already done in their tutorial video. The modifications that I'm taking for this quilt have already been covered. So if this isn't making sense to you and you want to see this in better detail, I'll link to their tutorial in the description box down below, and you can check that out. So this is kind of all of the fabric that I have left from the artist that I pulled, and I still have a little bit of work to do on this quilt. All 4 of my corners have this odd thing here, and if I'm being honest, I didn't really pay total attention to the tutorial from Jordan Fabrics. I'm the type of person that gets inspired by what I see, and then I just want to figure out how to do it on my own. I don't always want to follow the instructions. I don't know exactly what they did, but again, I will link their tutorial in the description box down below in case you want to follow it to a T. But I know that I need to square off all 4 of these corners. And so what I'm going to do is just cut out 4 squares of this background fabric. However wide this is, that's how I'm going to make my square. I want to make sure that it's at least the distance from here to here. And if I hold it this way, I know it is. That's why I know the measurement will work. But if you had yardage, you could just measure from this raw edge to this raw edge and then just cut out a square. We're going to sew that square here, and it's going to look really weird when it's all done, but we're going to trim that off to square out the corners. Now that I'm thinking about this, it would also be really easy to just set it on the diagonal, cut that, and then sew here. You see what I'm talking about? Yeah. So I won't need all 4 squares that I cut. Apparently this quilt is the master of waste, but that's okay. We're figuring it out as we go. Sometimes the challenge in making a quilt is just in figuring out how to do it. Now that I've got those 4 triangles, I'm just going to line up that long edge in each corner and stitch this on. Now I'm just going to press these little triangles out and away from the quilt, and you'll notice that they're kind of not lined up with the raw edges. I'm not worried about that because when I square this up, everything's going to come in really nice. Now that my 4 corners are on, we're going to need to clean this up. You'll notice as I pressed those out in a way that this triangle wasn't necessarily lined up with the edges that it was next to. And so all I'm going to do to clean this up is grab a ruler, line it up with the edge of the quilt here, get my rotary cutter, and just come right through so that that edge of that triangle now lines up with the edge of the quilt that it's attached to. I'm going to do that on all 4 sides on both corners of that. This is also a really good opportunity to make sure that your quilt is square. So when I'm doing this, I'm making sure that this edge of the quilt lines up evenly on a mark on my ruler. And then I'm going to clean up here, and that's going to give me a perfect 90-degree, which will help me trim up this quilt if I would like to. Well, you're going to square it up at some point. Whether you do it before and or after the quilting is kind of up to you. Now that we have the corners of our quilts all cleaned up, it's time to decide if we're going to add another border or not. Here's what I'm thinking. This quilt is plenty big enough to be a very comfy crib quilt and maybe even an okay lap quilt or a wheelchair quilt, which I think is kind of great. So I don't want to add too much size to it. If I were to add borders to this, it's just going to make it a bigger version of a baby quilt or a lap quilt or a wheelchair quilt. And I really don't think that that size is needed. I think it's an okay size the way it is. Plus, I don't really have a ton of this grunge left, which is what I would want to use for the border, but I also want to use this for the binding. Additionally, I'm thinking about the design element of this quilt, and I kind of like the way it looks where all the diamonds are kind of floating on themselves. So if I added a border, I feel like that's going to distract from it. Now, I feel like I could add the background as a border all the way around, but this is really kind of all I have left of my background. And you can see there's not enough here to really do anything with. And so I'm going to have to leave it as is. I think this is the size we're going to go with, which I think is perfectly fine. And then this is going to be the binding. even if I did have enough, and maybe I do, to do borders and binding out of this, I don't think I like it. I want this to be the binding. Too much of this is going to take away from the design element of the quilt. Now, a couple of things that I want to talk about before we wrap this video. I want to talk about the construction of this and some things that I learned. First off, these little triangles at the end, I was thinking all along, why am I waiting till the end to do this? But I actually kind of thought this was a neat idea because this is giving you a chance to put an oversized triangle over here and then square it up so you have a perfect 90-degree corner. So that's great. The only thing that makes me a little nervous to call this a beginner-friendly quilt, I don't know if you can see this, but it's a little wavy along the sides here, and that's because this whole edge, in fact, every edge of this quilt is bias. That means that this is super, super stretchy. Now, I feel like you can avoid that if you did this just a little bit differently. You know how when we started all of our on-point rows and we sewed the short edge of a triangle to one of the squares? What if instead of doing a triangle, you just did another square that's the same size as your squares in the rest of the quilt? Yes, you're going to have jagged edges all along all four sides of your quilt, but you're not going to have a bias edge until you cut it. And so that would give you the chance to come through and attach a border on all four sides of your quilt and then trim off the excess so that that fabric is stabilized before it ever becomes stretchy and bias. I already know I'm going to have some fullness in the quilt top because of these bias edges, but I think it's going to be fine. I'll just quilt it out on the long arm and we'll be okay. So that's relatively it. Yes, the quilt is a whole lot smaller than what theirs was, and I could size that up by bringing in some additional charm packs and making more blocks, or I could have gone with the original layer cake if I wanted to. Ideally, this quilt size is a great size for a baby or an infant throw, so I think I'm going to keep it. I'm going to quilt it up. It's always a good idea to have a quilt ready for a baby in your stash because you never know when one of your friends is going to come around expecting. I hope this video encouraged you and inspired you to unleash your own creativity and use a pattern as a starting off point in your future projects. I'll see you guys all in the next video. Bye!